Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm here today to continue reading to you from Witch by Eva Ibbotson. It's published by Scholastic, and we're very lucky that they have allowed us to read it. We're going to pick up where we left off with Chapter 9. We have just finished the very first contestant of the contest that they're doing, where Mabel Rack tried to call the Kraken from the ocean and instead called a baby Kraken. Chapter 9. Mabel's marks were announced that night. She had scored 4 out of a possible 10. A low mark and one that would have been lower if Ahriman had his way. But, as kind Mr. Chatterjee pointed out, she had called up the Kraken from the deep, and it wasn't her fault that the thing had turned out the way that it had. The low score pleased all the other witches, and Ethel Feedbag, whose turn came on the following day, was heard lurching and roistering around the campfire until long after midnight, hiccuping over her parsnip wine and falling asleep with her head on her pig and her wellies dangerously close to the embers. Belladonna, of course, couldn't help feeling a little sorry for Mabel, who had retired huffily into her sleeping bag with wet towels around her legs. But Terence didn't pretend to be anything but pleased. "You'll see, Belladonna, you'll win, you're bound to." He had brought Rover down earlier, and just by touching the slender, peaceful body of her familiar, Belladonna had been able to turn the passion flowers into bloodshot eyeballs and the golden pears into thumb screws. She'd left the baby rabbits because, as she said to Terence, it was knowing that she could turn them into decayed appendixes that was most important. "How is, he?" she asked now. And Terence said that Ahriman was a little upset. He could have said more, but he knew that Belladonna was in love, and nothing hurts people more than to think that someone they love is not altogether perfect. In fact, Ahriman had been yelling like nobody's business on account of the Kraken. Absolutely nothing could persuade the Kraken that Ahriman was not its father, and the magician had to change his shoes 3 times between tea and supper because the thing insisted on sitting on his feet. Krakens make their own wetness from the inside and can breathe in air as well as water, so there was nothing to stop the dreaded denizen of the deep from trying to climb into Ahriman's lap or shedding tears all over his trousers, and the great man was taking it very badly. "Oh, why didn't the new wizard cometh?" he raged at dinner. "I'd have been spared all this. Lester, take it away." "It's you he wants, sir," said the ogre reproachfully. But he scooped up the Kraken and put him in a soup tureen, for what with Sir Simon wailing in the wainscoting and Mr. Chatterjee sneezing in his bottle and the ghoul dribbling raw liver from his mouth, he did feel that perhaps his master had had enough. The following morning they were up early to see what witch number 2 was going to do. Ethel had chosen to perform her trick in a grassy and very beautiful hollow, in which, beside a bubbling brook, there grew an oak, an ash, and a thorn. These trees have, since the beginning of time, been very special trees. Even separately they are special, but when they grow together, well, anything can happen in a place like that. "Witch number 2, step forward," shouted Mr. Ledbetter, and Ethel, still wearing beneath her gown 3 moldering jerseys she slept in, lurched out from behind a rock, pushing a wheelbarrow and calling to her huge and mucky pig. "Hand in your list," Mr. Ledbetter ordered, and Ethel walked to the judge's table, which Lester had set out on a level patch of grass, and put down a crumpled piece of paper in front of Ahriman. The magician read it and passed a weary hand across his forehead. Witch number 2 wanted a man, a woman, and a child. "More fuss," he murmured. "Then fetch the telephone directory." So Terence ran up the hall and came back with a Todcaster and district directory. And Ahriman closed his eyes, flicked the pages, and stubbed his finger down on what turned out to be the bees. It's not difficult to work a telephone directory. Any wizard worth his salt can do it. You just press your finger down on the telephone number and say the right spells, and immediately you can see in your mind's eye the family that lives at the address. And after that, summing them by levitation is just child's play. So now Aramin ignored a Colonel Bellingbotter sitting pinkly in his bathtub at Todcaster 5930, passed over the Bender sisters doing keep fit exercises at 2378, and found the Bicknell family at Todcaster 9549, exactly what he was looking for. Mr. and Mrs. Bicknell and their daughter Linda were sitting at breakfast in their small semi at 187 Acacia Avenue. Miss Bicknell was still in her hairnet and curlers. Linda was dressed for school. Linda was 8 years old and her mother was 35, but what they both liked best was being nasty to Linda's father, Mr. Bicknell, and they were doing it now. "Why did you put on that stupid shirt?" said Mrs. Bicknell. "It makes you look like an ostrich with a croup." "Your hair's getting awfully thin on top, Daddy. You'll be bald soon. Won't you look silly when you're bald?" said Linda. "Mrs. Pierce across the road is getting a new washing machine. I suppose you know that I've had my washing machine for 3 years. Davinia's daddy is buying her a doll that can clean its own teeth. Why don't you buy me a doll like that?" Mr. Bicknell, a small, rather stooped man with a thin, tired face and a lined forehead, just went on quietly eating his cornflakes. He worked hard all day in his grocer's shop, helping the people he served to make their money go further, and when he came home at night, he went on helping. He helped his wife with the washing up and fixed shelves and dug the garden, but whatever he did, it made no difference. His wife and his daughter just nagged and nagged and nagged. "You didn't clean out the budgie cage properly," said Mrs. Bicknell, piling her toast with marmalade. "There's birdseed stuck to the corner. Davinia said being a grocer is silly. Only silly people are grocers," Davinia said. "And I wish for once that you would just..." But at this point, the windows began to rattle violently. Then they burst open, and the room was filled with a whirling, roaring wind, which lifted Mr. and Mrs. Bicknell and their daughter Lydia, and sent them out of the house, up, and away, to land, in what seemed to be just a moment of time, at Ethel Feedbag's feet. The country witch peered down at them and nodded. Then she stuck her boot under the shrieking, twitching Mrs. Bicknell and the howling, kicking Linda, and turned them over onto their backs. There was no need to turn over Mr. Bicknell, who already lay quietly looking upward at the sky. "Announce your trick," commanded Mr. Ledbetter through his megaphone. Ethel took the straw from her mouth, burped, and said, "I be going to shut the woman in the ash tree, and the man in the oak tree, and that bawlin' brat in the thorn tree." A whisper passed through the audience, and they looked at witch number 2 with a new respect. Imprisonment of human beings in trees is very old magic, and it is black as night. The Druids did it, and the witches of ancient Greece and Rome, and even now there are gaunt willows and shuddering alders from whose inside their own spirits have fled, to be replaced by some boastful traveler or careless shepherd who has lain there trapped in slumber for 1,000 years. Only Belinda, hiding with the other witches, was unhappy. "Those poor trees," she murmured. And indeed the trees were worth worrying about. The oak was one of those trees that are a whole world of their own. A great scarred trunk was full of clefts and hollows in which squirrels lived, and mice and little scurrying beasts. It stood rooted in a pool of soft green moss. Delicate acorn cups clung to its mazed branches, and its crown was a mass of autumnal gold. The ash was as tall, but slender, the smooth gray bark seeming like silver against the pale blue sky, and the key-shaped seeds hanging down in bunches from its upward sweeping boughs. A younger tree than the oak, but proud and regal as a queen. And lastly, the hawthorn, a powerful and knowing tree, with its writhing trunk, its blood-red berries clustered around fierce black barbs. Ethel Feedbag, meanwhile, had fetched a sack from a wheelbarrow and humped it to where the Bicknells lay. It was labeled mango wurzel meal, but it was better not to ask what was really in the powder she now sprinkled over the bawling, slug-faced Linda, her twitching mother, and the tired body of the grocer. Whatever it was, within seconds, all 3 of them lay unconscious on the ground. Grinning happily, Ethel now pulled up her gown, fumbled under her skirt, and from the elastic of her brown woolen knickers, drew a long, black-hilted witch's knife. And as she did so, Armin gasped and turned a chalky white. He had seen, clear as day, the dreaded wellies beneath the gown. For a moment it looked as though the great magician would cut and run, but the ogre and the secretary had already closed ranks behind him, and with a groan he sank back into his seat. Ethel, meanwhile, was spearing the bark of the thorn tree in a slimy, blood-colored paste. Then she picked up her knife and made a single long slit in its side. "Oh, Terence, I can't bear it," whispered Belladonna. "I don't suppose it feels any pain, Belladonna. I expect that's what the ointment's for, to stop it hurting." They watched breathlessly as the slit, of its own accord, grew wider, and became at last a gaping hole that led to the tree's very heart. Not bad," said Aramin, struggling to be fair, "though I prefer lighting myself. Neater." Ethel grunted, whacked her pig, and came back to stand with her knife poised over Linda. "Is she going to kill her?" asked Terence hopefully. But Ethel was crouching over Linda, murmuring a spell in a language so ancient and peculiar that none of them could make out a word. Over and over she chanted, and then slowly the nasty little schoolgirl rose from the grass, stuck her hands in front of her, and began to sleepwalk like a bewitched pudding right into the tree. "In," ordered Ethel, putting a boot in Linda's bottom. And lo and behold, Linda wobbled forward into the thorn tree, and the sides of the tree came together, closer, and the slit vanished, and she was gone. Next, Ethel went over to the ash. Again she rubbed the tree with ointment. Again she made a slit in its side, and again the slit widened to show the dark center of the tree. And now it was Mrs. Bicknell who rose, walked in a trance to the tree, and the tree closed around her, and she was gone. Ethel was just going to start the oak when there was an extremely angry rustling noise, which began at the hawthorn tree and moved over to where Ethel stood. A second, even angrier rustle followed. What these were the spirits of the thorn and of the ash, and they were in a very nasty temper indeed. "It is not at all convenient for me to be out this morning. You might have asked," added the spirit of the thorn. One cannot actually see tree spirits. They are simply a rustle, but one knows that if they could, they would be green, female, and easily upset. "Didn't ask you to shift," said Ethel. "Plenty of room for everybody." "Stay in with that repulsive child," said the spirit of the thorn. "You must be joking. I'm going home to mother." And she rustled off in the direction of an old hawthorn standing on the hill, followed by the spirit of the ash, still yammering with indignation. Ethel shrugged. Took more than a couple of rustles to upset a feedbag. She made a slit in the oak tree now and stood back as it opened, groaning and creaking and sending the squirrels and dormice scampering away in terror. Then Ethel went to fetch Mr. Blacknell, and he too got up and walked into the tree, and the tree closed over him, and he was gone. The judges, going over to have a closer look, were pleased. True, the thorn tree bulged at the bottom because of Linda's thighs, and its bark had come out in bumpy knots like boils. The golden leaves of the ash, too, were shriveling fast. Still, no passerby could have possibly guessed that 3 frantic, tortured human beings were imprisoned in this peaceful den. But of course, there was no question of giving out marks just yet. A true witch must be able to loosen an enchantment as well as weave it. "Undo the spell," ordered Aramin. Ethel had slumped down beside her pig. Now she got up and waddled over to the thorn. Again she made the slit in the tree. Again the slit widened, and out on the grass, like a crumpled maggot, rolled Linda Bicknell. Next, Ethel slit open the ash, and the lovely tree seemed to sigh with relief as Miss Bicknell, sticky with sap and minus 3 of her curlers, fell out again onto the grass. Smiling now, Ethel went over to the oak. Again she slit it. Again she stuck back and waited. Nothing happened. "Out!" ordered Ethel, jerking her head. Still nothing. Beneath the mask, Ethel's round face flushed with temper. "Out!" she said, stamping her foot. Silence. Then from the depth of the great tree, a quiet voice said, "No." Ethel's voice darkened to beetroot. "It's over," she hissed. "You come on out." But inside the oak tree, the tired grocer did not stir. What did come out of the tree was its spirit. Like the spirits of the ash and of the thorn, the spirit of the oak was simply a rustle, but it was older and a wiser one. "Leave him be," it said to Ethel Feedbag. "He wants to stay. He likes it in there. He says he'll come out when his wife's 90 and in a wheelchair and can't nag, and his daughter's left home for good. Stay in the tree, roared Ethel, angry as a bull. That's right, rustled the spirits. Says he's never been so happy in his life. He's no bother to me. He just wants to sleep most of the time. His wife used to snore and kick him around the bed. You know how it is, and I don't mind him. He's company, and you can see he doesn't mind. This was true. Unlike the thorn which had come out in boils, or the ash whose leaves had shriveled, the great oak stood calm and undisturbed by the grocer in his depth. Just do us up again, dear, ordered the spirit. It's getting drafty. He'll be all right in there for 50 years or so. I'll see he doesn't go moldy. Then someone can let him out, and the poor bloke can lead a decent life. So Ethel closed the tree up again. What could she do? But when Linda and her mother had been sent back to Acacia Avenue, and Ethel's marks came through, they were low. 4 out of 10, same as Mabel. What else could one expect? There is nothing black about shutting someone into a tree who simply loves it there. But if Ethel was furious, Armin was happy as a lark. Whatever happened, he wouldn't have to marry the witch in the wellies. All through supper he laughed and joked until he went upstairs and heard the steady drip, drip of water and found that the Kraken had climbed into his bed. Consider puddle. Chapter 10. No one ever forgot what happened when witch number 3 did her trick. It was really very horrible in a way that no one could have imagined, and even Aramin, used as he was to terror and disaster, could never think of it in years to come without feeling quite giddy and faint. Witch number 3 was Nancy Shudder, and when she announced her trick, there was a great deal of interest. I am going, she said, to make a bottomless hole. To make a bottomless hole is not easy. A bottomless hole is not a hole that comes out in Australia. A hole that comes out in Australia is a hole that comes out in Australia. It is not bottomless. No, bottomless is something very different. Bottomlessness is a mysterious nothingness that goes on forever. It is an interminable blackness. It is no echo, no plop when something drops in, no glimmer of water in its depths. Not only that, a bottomless hole has a demonic and unusual power. Anyone coming too close has an almost uncontrollable longing to throw himself into it. Everyone, therefore, was very pleased, and Mr. Chatterjee, becoming muddled in his excitement, said, "Oh, that is good, a bottom with no hole." So Nancy got to work. She had chosen the east lawn quite close to the house to do her trick, and she went about it in a businesslike manner, stubbing out her cigarette, putting her chicken down in the bonnet of the Caterpillar tractor that Mr. Ledbetter had hired for her, and setting the motor in motion so that the heavy rotary blades could dig up the soil. It was a mild and pleasant day. The other witches were clustered in the little summer house where they could see without being seen by Aramin. Even Madame Olympia had turned out with her aardvark. At the judge's table, which Lester had raised on wooden blocks so that they could see the digging better, Armin tried to forget the awful night he'd spent with the Kraken and his anxiety about the Wizard Watcher, who was sending brave but homesick postcards from places like Brighton and Southend-on-Sea, and prepared to give witch number 3 a chance. Nancy certainly seemed to know her job. True, her chicken was against her. All along the Shudder chickens had been rather a washout as familiars. They never crowed thrice, or flapped threateningly, or erected their wattles, and together they looked more like old age pensioners evicted from a battery than the kind of bird that one finds in fairy stories or in fights. All the same, Nancy was doing all right. From working in the railway, both the Shudder twins were good with mechanical things, and after about an hour, Nancy drove the tractor away to the other side of the lawn, and the real task began. Because, of course, at this stage, the thing was simply a hole. Nancy had dug up some old drain pipes and part of a tin and an old ham bone of the Wizard Watchers and masses of shale and sludge. She had made a deep hole, a good hole, the kind of hole that little boys stand and gape at on the way to school. But though its bottom was a long way down, was still there. But now the magic began. First, Nancy circled the hole with her wand, scratching a witch's pentacle deep in the surrounding soil. 5 times she walked windershins around the hole, and 5 times she walked not windershins, keeping always to the far side of the magic symbol. Then she put down her wand and picked up her chicken, and raising it aloft, turned to the north. "Spirits of the north, I bid thee suck the bottom from this hole," she intoned. Then, still holding her chicken, she turned to the west. "Spirits of fire, I bid thee burn the bottom from this hole," cried Nancy Shudder. And then she turned to the east and bade the spirits of the air to blow the bottom from the hole. But now the chicken had had enough. It fluttered, squawking from her arms, and it was chickenless that Nancy turned to the south and commanded that the spirits of the water drown the bottom from the hole. After which she said the Lord's Prayer backwards, and then the spell was complete. It's always hard, the bit between the end of a piece of magic and the time when it's supposed to work. No one is good at waiting, and witches least of all. Nancy had begun most irritably to tap her toes when the scream began. It was a scream such as no one can imagine. A scream as if a million giants were being disemboweled with red-hot pincers. A scream that grew louder and more unendurable each second, till everyone present thought that their skulls must shatter with the pain of it. And how could it be otherwise? For this was a scream of a hole losing the only thing it has, its bottom. And when the noise had died away at last and the pain of their ears had gone, the judges walked over to where Nancy stood. Taking care not to go too close because of the fearsome power a bottomless hole has to drive things in, they examined and discussed and considered. And they were pleased. Araminot was nodding, Mr. Chatterjee in his bright turban was bobbing up and down, and the white, exhausted face of the old ghoul had cracked into something almost like a smile. For while it is true that there is not actually much you can do with a bottomless hole, it at least cannot turn out to be someone's aunt like the mermaids, nor can it make anybody happy like Mr. Bicknell had been made happy by being shut into a tree. As they returned to the table, it was clear that the judges were going to give Nancy a much higher mark than they had awarded to Ethel Feedbag or Mabel Rack. But before they could make an announcement, there was a scuffle from the summer house. Belladonna cried, "Oh, please don't!" And then Nora Shudder, shaking herself loose, catapulted into the east lawn, brandishing her chicken as she came. "You're a cheat!" she screamed, charging up to her twin. "You're a cheat and a twister and a liar. That is my chicken you've got there. You've done your trick with my chicken, so it doesn't count." "I have not done your trick with your chicken, done my trick with your chicken. I have done my trick with my chicken." "You haven't." "You have." And face to face on the east lawn, the Shudder sisters' fury and loathing reached new heights. "And anyway," yelled Nora, "I don't believe your hole is bottomless. It's just a hole." "My hole is so bottomless." "No, it isn't." "Yes, it is." Ehrman had risen from his seat, his devilish eyebrows meeting in an angry frown. And in the summer house, Belladonna covered her face. But nothing could stop the Shudders now. Both had put down their chickens and stood facing each other with murder in their eyes. "If you say my hole isn't bottomless one more time, I'll finish you, you worm-eaten stick," screamed Nancy, forgetting the contest, forgetting everything. "It isn't bottomless! It isn't bottomless! It isn't bottomless!" screamed Nancy, quite eaten up with jealousy and temper. What happened next happened with terrifying speed. Nancy stepped forward and pushed her sister hard, sending her reeling to fall backwards with her legs in the air. Then, as Nora tried to rise, Nancy pushed her again. And this time she fell inside the magic pentacle. Even then, Nancy might have saved her twin, but she stood there, unmoving, her face suffused with an evil, gloating triumph, as Nora half rose, swayed, and then tottered of her own accord towards the round, black maw. Right at the edge, she managed to pause and tried to desperately take a step backward. Too late. There was a hideous, roaring, sucking sound. Nora's arm went up, and then the hole took her, and she was gone. The campsite that night was as silent as a grave. Araman, white with shock, had disqualified witch number 3 and ordered the east lawn to be cleared. Nancy, though, had hardly seemed to hear what he said, but just stood there, blindly gazing at the spot where her sister had last stood, and in the end it was Belladonna who had led her away and put her to bed in the tent she had shared with Nora. Does it matter which of our chickens is which now? Does it? Was all Nancy had said as Belladonna settled the sad brown birds into their coops. And Belladonna, who knew perfectly well which chicken was which and always had, agreed that it didn't matter now. It didn't matter at all. The horribleness of what happened kept everyone in a state of shock through the following day, which was the one on which Nora should have done her act. Mr. Chatterjee stayed curled in his bottle like a baby that doesn't want to be born. Ehrman didn't even notice when the Kraken dribbled onto his best elastic-sided boots, and at the campsite the witches stopped bickering for once, shamed by the tragedy that had overtaken them. But the strangest thing of all was what had happened to Nancy. Nancy had turned overnight from a loudmouth, bossy, chain-smoking witch into a timid, shrunken person who just lay in her camp bed in her vest and knickers, refusing to wash or dress or eat, telling anyone who came near that it didn't matter which chicken was which. "She's gone off for nothing, you'll mark my words," said Mother Bloodwort. "I've seen it before. She's flipped." Terence couldn't understand it. She hated Nora so much, didn't she, Belladonna? So why is she so upset? Belladonna crinkled her forehead, trying to work it out. "I suppose hating Nora was sort of a part of Nancy. I mean, it was what being Nancy was about. And now Nora's gone and she isn't anyone, just a wraith." But however worried they were about Nancy, the contest had to go on. So later that afternoon, Terence and Belladonna set off from the woods behind the campsite and practiced with Rover, turning the golden bracken fronds into leprous fingers and conjuring little spitting dragons from a bramble bush. They discovered that Rover's power was so strong that it could work from inside the matchbox, even when Terence held it closed. And then this was a great help, because with the box open, Rover had wandered about rather a lot. "Funny, I thought I heard someone moving over there, behind those elms," said Belladonna as they sat resting in a grassy clearing, letting Rover crawl confidently across their hands. They peered through the trees, but there was no one there. Yet both of them had an eerie feeling of being watched, and by someone far more sinister than lumbering Ethel or fishy Mabel Rack. "Perhaps we'd better put him away," said Terence, scooping Rover back into his box. They kept his incredible powers secret from the other witches, and they meant to keep on doing so. And if they could not see the cunning enchantress loping away from the clearing, then who could blame them? She had taken the form much used by witches, that of a fleet and silent hare, but no real hare ever had in its eye the look that was in this one, evil and calculating and unbelievably cruel. Chapter 11. The following day, it was Mother Bloodwort's turn. She had spent the whole of the evening before in a last desperate attempt at the turning herself young again spell, rushing from her tent to the toilet block and back again with little jars of crushed gallbladder from the inside of murderers, powdered mandrake picked under a dying moon, and a whole lot of other noxious things which she rubbed onto herself, croaking weird rhymes that she did. But it hadn't helped. As she was announced by Mr. Ledbetter and tottered out into the Italian garden, she was unmistakably Mother Bloodwort, warts, whiskers, cloud of flies, and all. Ehrman, of course, recognized her at once. But to the surprise of Mr. Ledbetter and the ogre, he did not try to escape. The reason for this was simple. He had decided that if the witch with the whiskers won the contest, he, Arm the Awful, would kill himself. He would do this in some very dramatic way, perhaps by plunging over the cliff into the boiling waters of the Devil's Cauldron, or by falling into one of the swords that Lester was always swallowing, but he would do it. So he was quite calm as witch number 5 hobbled toward him and handed him her list, and he stayed calm until he read it. It was Mother Bloodwort who'd wanted the 7 princesses. She was going to do an old-fashioned trick, but a very famous one, the one in which 7 beautiful maidens of the royal blood are turned into 7 black swans doomed to wing their way across the waters of the world through all eternity. There's probably nothing sadder or more romantic in all magic than this spell. One minute you have these lively, bright-eyed girls with all their lives before them, and often a prince or two in the offing, And then there comes a ghastly moment when their golden hair turns into black down, and their rosebud mouths become beaks, and their pretty feet and silver slippers change into webbed toes, till at last the great black tragic birds fly away into the sunset, never to return. As a setting for this trick, Mother Bloodwort had chosen the Italian garden, which lay beside the lake. Ehrman hadn't gone round to much blighting and smiting there, and it was a beautiful spot with urns and statues and wide gravel paths which swept down to the shimmering water. But now the great magician had read her list. 7 princesses, he roared. 7? You must be mad. Mother Bloodwort, however, was not to be put off. Aye, 7. Proper ones. Royal. You can't just whirl princesses through the air like commoners, you know, Ehrman said. These things have to be done properly. Decent transportation and all that. And they're not in the telephone directory. But Mother Bloodwort, obstinate old witch that she was, just stood there waiting. Ehrman sighed. Tell everyone to go away for an hour, Ledbetter, he said. I have to go to my laboratory for this. And send me that nephew of yours. He's a useful lad and I could do with an extra pair of hands. So Mr. Ledbetter took the witches back to the camp, and Terence, beaming with pride, followed Ehrman and the ogre into the laboratory, with its bubbling crucibles and fiendish flasks. Actually, there is a sort of telephone directory for the princesses, said the magician. It's called the Almanac de Gotha. Run and get it from a library boy. It's a big, gold-bound book on the second shelf as you go in. Terence was back in no time, his eyes shining with excitement. Let's see. There's a Spanish family descended from Carlos the Cruel, I believe. It's good there seems to be a daughter. I had to find something in Austria. What about the Habsburgs? They're certainly royal enough. Can't we have a British princess? Asked Lester. Ehrman shook his head. Not wise, I think. He continued to flick the pages. We'll have to scrape the barrel a bit. Still, let's get to work. For nearly an hour, Ehrman magicked, murmuring spells, twirling his wand, going backwards and forwards between his potion and his vellum-bound books. Once he said, Strange, I feel an unusual force in this room. Things are coming through much faster than usual. But though Terence exchanged a look with Lester, he said nothing. Rover was in his pocket, but if Belladonna was to win the contest, the worm's special power had to be kept a secret. Right, said the magician. You can fetch them back all back now. The last one's just coming through. Because sure enough, rather beautifully arranged around the rim of the fountain, were 7 princesses. Ehrman had kept his word, and all of them were of the blood royal, but that was as far as he'd been able to go. It was no use pretending that they were a matching set of lovely girls. The Princess Olga Zurinsky, for example, a niece of one of the last Grand Dukes of Russia, was 92 and crippled with rheumatism, so that Ehrman had to conjure her up a wheelchair. On the other hand, an African princess, descended from King Solomon himself, was lying asleep in her cradle. The Spanish princess, though beautifully dressed in couture, had a wooden leg, and the Indian princess was almost invisible in a cloud of exhaust from her motorcycle. There was another young princess from America wearing Levi's and a t-shirt emblazoned with I am Batman's friend. Her ancestors had left France when Louis Philippe had lost his throne. And there was a middle-aged Austrian one whose nose came down over her chin because she was a Habsburg. And they have been famous throughout history for being the ugliest rulers in the world. And then there was an Eastern princess in silken trousers who had Mr. Chatterjee swooshing out of his bottle with excitement. Mother Bloodwort, meanwhile, had announced her trick. I'm going to turn 7 princesses of the blood royal into 7 black swans, she said. And then, feeling perhaps that something was missing, she added, tee-hee, which was the nearest that she could get to an evil cackling laughter. Then she vanished behind a statue of the god Pan and returned with a broomstick. It was the crummiest, most moth-eaten broomstick anyone had ever seen. Mother Bloodwort had made it herself from brushwood she had found at the back of the campsite. But everyone was pleased because it meant that she was going to do hobby horse magic. This is the kind where you ride around and around your victims, going faster and ever faster, dizzying them with your speed and your spells until the transformation is complete. It is old-fashioned magic, but it is very powerful. So now Mother Bloodwort went over to the fountain, blew a hole in her cloud of flies, and stood peering at the princesses. Then she laid her wrinkled hand on the Spanish one in her turquoise gown. You, she said, pulling her forward onto the gravel path. Ehrman had hypnotized the princesses as they came, so that Princess Juanita followed the crone obediently, her wooden leg clacking a little as she walked. Mother Bloodwort now mounted her broomstick, groaning as she heaved her stiff old legs onto the handle, which she had greased with the melted body fat of maddened skunks, and began to ride around and around the royal Spanish lady. "Haddock away, you magic broom, send this princess to her doom," shrieked Mother Bloodwort. Faster and faster she rode, sending her hood tumbling back and her white hair streaming, while the cloud of flies clung desperately to her flushed face and heaving chest. So crazy did she look, so exhausted and so old, that no one really expected the magic to work. But they were wrong. Strange and terrible things were happening to Princess Juanita. Her hair wavered, vanished, her head was shimmering, and now it was covered in feathers, and her full, pouting mouth was changing. Yes, it was changing into a beak. "She's done it, Terence. Mother Bloodwort's done it," cried Belladonna joyfully from the pavilion. Once more, Mother Bloodwort circled the doomed princess. Then she dismounted and stood back. "Drat," said Mother Bloodwort. For while it was true that she had completely transformed the princess into a bird, it was not a swan, it was a duck. And the princess having had trouble with her leg, it was a lame duck. Everyone stared gloomily at the enchanted bird as it waddled quacking towards the water. Why is there such a difference between a duck and a swan? It is hard to say, but there just is. This one seemed to be a khaki Campbell, and not to be the sort of person that a prince might fall in love with, recognizing it for the imprisoned soul that it was. But Mother Bloodwort was not daunted. Leaving the duck to stare moodily at a clump of reeds, she took her broomstick back to the fountain and led it over to the Eastern princess, lovely as an orchard in her shimmering trousers and golden blouse. "Oh," moaned Mr. Chatterjee. He had never married, not being sure if his wife would settle in a bottle, and the Princess Shari was all that he desired. Again, the princess followed the old witch meekly. Again, Mother Bloodwort rode around and around her on her broomstick, reciting her rhyme. "It's going to work this time," whispered Belladonna. "Look, the feathers are black. It'll be a lovely swan, you'll see." And they watched breathless as Mother Bloodwort slowed down and dismounted. "I see that I am to be spared nothing," muttered Ahriman the Awful, while beside him Mr. Chatterjee howled with pain. For the bird, now tottering like an overfed alderman towards the lake, was a fat, sleek, and foolish-looking penguin. For a moment Mother Bloodwort was very much put out, but once more she pulled herself together, and coughing up a number of dead flies, she re-greased her broom and went to fetch the American princess with her pigtail and her t-shirt. But the princess did not seem to be as hypnotized as the other. "This is ridiculous," she complained. "What a joke! Make me a black swan or I'll call my lawyer." But it was not to be. Of all the heart-rending things to see that they had to watch, one of the worst was seeing the great-great-great-granddaughter of Louis Philippe sitting on a branch and saying in that silly way that budgies have, even in America, "Please give Polly a cracker. Polly wants a cracker, please." It was Belladonna who knew what was going to happen next. Mother Bloodwort had dropped her broomstick, her shoulders sagged, and her cloud of flies grew silent. "Don't!" cried Belladonna. "Oh, please, Mother Bloodwort, don't!" Too late. Already the budgie, looking surprised, had hopped onto the thing that now stood foursquare upon the path beside the lake. The ghoul woke and said, "Vomit." Mr. Chatterjee shook his turbaned head sadly from side to side, and Ahriman rose from his seat. "No one," he said, "can accuse me of not doing my bit for wizardry and darkness, but there is one thing I will not do, and that is marry a coffee table." And pulling his mantle close about him, the outraged wizard strode away. That's the end of where we're going to read today. We'll pick up with chapter 12 tomorrow. And chapter 12 is the night before Madame Olympia's turn, which is sure to be very spooky. Once again, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm reading Witch Witch by Eva Ibbotson, published by Scholastic. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you soon. Bye!